Miss Marple and the lifeless body in the theatre. Dear friends, welcome once again to Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and I'm so happy to have your company this evening. Share with us where you're listening from, whether you've ever visited a theatre and the most beautiful play you've ever seen. Don't forget to subscribe before the story begins. Now, make yourself comfortable and enjoy the tale. Chapter 1. An invitation to join the Amateur Dramatic Society. There are certain English villages which appear, to the casual passer-by, to exist in a manner both entirely real and yet faintly detached from the ordinary movement of time. St. Mary Mead was one of them. Its lanes were narrow without being neglected, its cottages neat without ostentation, and its gardens cultivated with that quiet seriousness which suggests not merely hobby, but principle. Roses were pruned with care, hedges clipped to a respectful height, and the village notice board beside the post office was consulted, with such reliable regularity that it had come, over the years, to possess something of the dignity of a public institution. On a fine morning in early June, Miss Jane Marple paused before this board on her way home from the wool shop, where she had purchased a modest quantity of pale blue wool for a cardigan she had nearly finished, and then, on reflection, decided would benefit from being begun again properly. Miss Marple was a slight elderly lady of unassuming appearance, with white hair arranged neatly beneath a sensible hat, and pale blue eyes of so mild an expression that the careless observer might easily mistake their steadiness for vagueness. Such an observer would have been mistaken. Miss Marple's gaze moved over the world in a manner at once gentle and exact, and if she seemed to notice very little, it was because she had long ago learned the advantage of appearing to do so. The notice pinned at the centre of the board was printed on cream card in cheerful dark lettering. It announced that the Larkfield Amateur Dramatic Society would present a charity performance of a light comedy at the Larkfield Town Theatre on the evening of the 22nd of June. All proceeds were to go to the Larkfield Cottage Hospital. Tickets, the card declared, might be obtained from Mrs. Birch at the haberdashery, or from the honorary secretary of the society, whose name appeared at the bottom in smaller, more modest print. Miss Marple read the notice twice, as was her custom, and then went quietly on her way. She might have thought no more of the matter had not Mrs. Doris Fellows telephoned her that same afternoon in a state of cheerful excitement. Mrs. Fellows, a sociable and warm-hearted woman of about 60, had lived in St. Mary Mead for most of her married life, and had the happy gift of becoming connected sooner or later with nearly every harmless local enterprise. She announced that she herself was involved, if only in a modest capacity, with the forthcoming theatrical performance, having undertaken to assist with programmes and refreshments. Would Miss Marple, she asked, care to accompany her to a rehearsal the following Tuesday evening? It would be a pleasant outing. The theatre at Larkfield was really very charming, and the society, she said, had become quite lively of late. Miss Marple accepted with quiet pleasure. Larkfield lay some 4 miles from St. Mary Mead, along a road bordered first by hedgerows and open fields, and then by the tidier outskirts of a modest market town. It was not a large place, but it possessed certain civic aspirations, and chief among them was the town theatre. The building dated from the latter part of the previous century and had been renovated between the wars at sufficient expense to give it, within its limited scale, an air of local pride. Its facade was of red brick, with a decorative pediment above the entrance, and brass handles polished to a brightness that spoke well for whoever was responsible for the maintenance. Inside there was a respectable auditorium, rows of upholstered seats, a stage of fair size and backstage accommodation that, though not extensive, was thought very adequate by everyone except those most inclined to theatrical complaint. The stage itself was lit by a rig of electric lamps suspended overhead, and these cast a bright, flattening light which revealed every costume in perfection, and lent to amateur acting a merciless clarity, not always improved by enthusiasm. The Larkfield Amateur Dramatic Society had existed for 30 years or thereabouts, and drew its members from the town and the surrounding villages. It was, by all accounts, a congenial body. Its members included shopkeepers, a retired schoolmaster, a solicitor's clerk, several farmers' wives, and others whose devotion to the stage varied from the intensely sincere to the pleasantly social. Like most such societies, it contained both true lovers of drama and those whose attachment was more properly to committee life, applause, or the agreeable business of being connected with something public. Among its more recent additions was a gentleman named Mr. Leonard Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard had come to the district some 8 months earlier and had taken a furnished cottage near the edge of Larkfield. He was a man of perhaps 50, with an instinctive understanding of presentation that was very nearly professional. He was always suitably dressed, always agreeable, and always managed to appear just faintly more distinguished than circumstances strictly demanded. His voice was expressive without being theatrical in ordinary conversation, and his manners were attentive in exactly that proportion which makes attentiveness flattering rather than burdensome. He possessed, in short, the ease of a man who knew how to occupy a room and how to leave it, having improved the impression of himself within it. He had joined the society that sprang upon the recommendation of Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, one of its oldest and most respected supporters. Mrs. Whitcomb was a widow of 62, tall, composed, and of a decidedly handsome appearance. Everything about her suggested order, capability, and the sort of settled self-command that inspires trust in committees and fundraising efforts. Since the death of her husband some years before, she had devoted much of her energy to charitable and village concerns. She sat on the hospital committee, organised the annual fete, and had long been the principal force behind the Society's charity performances. Her judgment was highly regarded, and in matters of local reliability she stood very nearly beyond question. It was generally understood that Mrs. Whitcomb had known Mr. Pritchard slightly before his arrival in the district through some theatrical connection of former years. She had spoken well of him to the chairman of the society, Mr. Geoffrey Horton, and Mr. Horton, a compact and slightly fussy man who managed the local ironmongers and approached chairmanship with almost military earnestness, had welcomed Mr. Pritchard and cast him in one of the leading roles of the forthcoming comedy. The choice had been widely approved, though there were naturally one or two members whose private estimate of their own dramatic powers had led them to expect rather more consideration. Such sentiments are common enough in amateur dramatic circles, and where not nourished too openly need do no lasting harm. When Mrs. Fellows and Miss Marple arrived at the theatre on the appointed Tuesday evening, rehearsal was already underway. They were shown to seats in the front row of the auditorium by a young woman in a paint-stained apron who introduced herself in a whisper as the assistant stage manager and informed them that the third act was nearly complete and there would shortly be a break. Miss Marple settled herself with every appearance of amiable interest and directed her gaze toward the stage. The rehearsal proceeded with that curious mixture of energy, confusion, sincerity, and unintended comedy that belongs particularly to amateur productions 3 weeks before performance. Lines were occasionally misplaced. One earnest actress had to be repositioned several times before she succeeded in standing where the light was least unfavourable. Mr. Horton called occasional instructions from the second row in tones suggesting that, but for his vigilance, collapse of the entire enterprise was imminent. Mr. Pritchard, however, was markedly at ease. Even from these fragments of performance it was plain that he possessed a natural assurance which distinguished him from the others. He moved with confidence, gave his lines with appropriate lightness and control, and seemed genuinely to listen when spoken to upon the stage, an ability rarer than might be supposed among actors, amateur or otherwise. Mrs. Whitcomb was present not as a performer, but as organiser, supporter, and that highly useful figure who is not technically in command and yet is obeyed more readily than anyone else. She sat to one side of the stage with a clipboard, speaking from time to time to cast and crew in the composed, low voice of a woman whose authority did not require display. At last the third act concluded, and Mr. Horton called a quarter-hour break. Instantly the atmosphere relaxed. People stretched, laughed, compared notes, and drifted away into small temporary clusters of conversation. Mrs. Fellows turned to Miss Marple with some whispered observations on the acting of the second female lead, but Miss Marple's attention had remained fixed upon the stage. Mr. Pritchard had not joined the others. He remained standing under one of the principal lamps, a small notebook in his hand, apparently reviewing his lines. There was, on the face of it, nothing unusual in that. Many conscientious performers used breaks in precisely such a way. And yet, as Miss Marple watched him, she became aware of something in the quality of his stillness that was not easy to define. He was not merely resting, nor was he, as one sometimes sees, lightly self-conscious beneath observation. Rather, there was about him the strange appearance of a man attending carefully to something private. The lamps above were very bright. Their heat could be felt even from the front row. The rest of the company had mostly withdrawn from the full glare of the stage. Mrs. Whitcomb had stepped briefly backstage. Then, without any cry, stumble, clutching movement, or abrupt loss of balance, Mr. Pritchard closed his notebook. He placed one hand against the side of the proscenium arch, very deliberately indeed, as though for guidance rather than rescue, and then, with a slowness so curious that Miss Marple afterwards remembered it in detail, he descended to the stage floor and lay still. For one fraction of a second the thing was so strange that nobody moved. Then the commotion began. Several members of the company rushed forward at once. A chair was overturned. Somebody exclaimed sharply. Mr. Horton shouted for air in the sort of loud, practical voice people employ when they are frightened and wish not to appear so. Dr. Clement Faraday, who belonged to the society and had been sitting farther back in the auditorium, came forward immediately and knelt beside Mr. Pritchard with composed efficiency. His examination was brief. He then announced that Mr. Pritchard had suffered what appeared to be a serious cardiac collapse. The man was alive, but required immediate rest and proper medical attention. An ambulance was to be summoned at once. The orders were carried out with the genuine urgency that follows real alarm. Someone ran for the telephone. Someone else fetched water, though nobody had asked for it. Mrs. Whitcomb reappeared from backstage and, receiving the news with a face of controlled concern, began quietly directing practical necessities. Coats, doors, messages. People moved where they would be most useful and least obstructive. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. Later, as she and Mrs. Fellows walked back along the lane toward the motor car, Mrs. Fellows spoke with natural distress of the dreadful scene, of how unexpected it had all been, and of the extraordinary uncertainty of life, since Mr. Pritchard had seemed in such excellent spirits no more than minutes earlier. Miss Marple agreed gently that it had been most distressing. She did not add what else had struck her, for as she settled her hat more firmly against the evening air and stepped into the car, her mind was already occupied less with the fact of the collapse than with its character. There had been in it something curiously unlike the sudden overthrow of nature. It had not presented itself to her, in that instant beneath the stage lamp, as the movement of a man overtaken by misfortune. Rather, and she did not at once know why she thought so, it had seemed to her the movement of a man, arriving with care and intention at an ending already in some manner arranged. Chapter 2. A Rehearsal that fell silent too soon. There is a particular kind of silence which settles over a village after something unexpected has happened within its orbit. It is not silence in the strict sense, for people continue to speak, to shop, to post letters, to remark upon the weather, and to conduct all the ordinary transactions of daily life. But beneath these familiar surfaces there runs a subtle adjustment, as though the community itself were determining how the event is to be placed among its collective understandings. St. Mary Mead knew such silences well, and wore them, as it wore most things, with good breeding and an appearance of moderation. The news of Mr. Leonard Pritchard's collapse at the Larkfield Theatre travelled with all the speed customary to small communities, which is to say rather more swiftly than accuracy generally approves. By the following morning it was known at the post office, at the baker's, and at the hairdresser's that a gentleman had been taken seriously ill during rehearsal. By afternoon, there had attached themselves to this foundation several additions, none wholly impossible and none yet verified. That Mr. Pritchard had long had trouble with his heart, that the heat on the stage had been excessive, that he had been working too hard, and that Dr. Faraday had behaved with admirable coolness throughout. Mr. Pritchard had been taken to the Larkfield Cottage Hospital, where he remained under observation. Dr. Faraday, being a sensible man with an understanding of how much and how little should be said, informed those who asked with sufficient directness that the patient had suffered a grave cardiac episode. Recovery was not out of the question, but much would depend upon rest, management, and time. Visitors were not encouraged beyond those strictly necessary. The Larkfield Amateur Dramatic Society responded with decorum and practical common sense. Mr. Horton called a brief committee meeting at which it was agreed that rehearsals would be suspended for the remainder of the week as a mark of respect, that a card signed by the entire membership would be sent to the hospital, and that the question of the performance should be postponed until the circumstances became clearer. There was naturally some quiet discussion of understudies and replacements, since charitable performances do not sustain themselves by sentiment alone, but this was handled with sufficient delicacy to preserve everyone's sense of propriety. It was during one of the small social gatherings that followed this interruption that Miss Marple first had an opportunity to observe the members of the society at something closer to ease. Mrs. Fellows, whose involvement in programmes and refreshments gave her an entirely respectable basis for inclusion, had been invited to tea at the home of Miss Constance Armitage, who played the second female lead and lived in a comfortable terraced house near the Market Square in Larkfield. Miss Armitage was a pleasant, rather voluble woman of about 45, with the authority that long membership and genuine enthusiasm tend to bestow in such organisations. She had invited several of the cast and committee. Mrs. Fellows brought Miss Marple with her. Miss Marple accepted her cup of tea, settled herself in a chair near the window, and produced her knitting with the mild composure of a woman who had come prepared to pass a pleasant hour. There are positions in rooms, as she knew very well, from which one may see everything while appearing to notice nothing, and the chair she selected was one of them. The talk, as might have been expected, turned soon and naturally to Mr. Pritchard. What was said of him was warm, and Miss Marple thought sincerely so. He was described as a gifted performer, a delightful colleague, a man who brought an almost professional polish to the production without making the rest feel clumsy by comparison. Miss Armitage remarked that he possessed that rare and valuable quality on the stage of seeming genuinely to hear what another actor was saying, rather than waiting merely for the cue to speak himself. This observation was received with considerable agreement. A younger member of the company, Mr. Thomas Vane, who played a minor comic part and appeared to be in his early 30s, observed with thoughtful concern that Mr. Pritchard had perhaps thrown himself into the rehearsal process with more energy than was strictly wise for a man of his years and condition. He said this kindly, but with a smoothness of phrasing that caused Miss Marple to think he was a man who had some experience in saying appropriate things at appropriate times. Several others agreed that the theatre became extremely warm under full lighting, and that the heat alone would try anyone, even a perfectly healthy person. The conclusion gradually formed itself with that comfortable inevitability by which group opinion likes to arrive where it is unconsciously intended from the start. Mr. Pritchard had overexerted himself, the heat had done the rest, and the unfortunate result was one of those sad occurrences that nobody could have foreseen. Miss Marple continued to knit. Among those present was Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, who arrived shortly after Miss Marple and Mrs. Fellows, and took her place in the best chair almost without the fact of its being offered seeming to occur as a separate event. Mrs. Whitcomb was one of those women who wear self-command so habitually that it becomes less a quality than a texture of the entire person. She accepted tea, expressed gratitude, and entered into the conversation with measured warmth. She spoke of Mr. Pritchard with feeling. She said she'd known him, though not intimately, some years before his arrival in the district, and had been genuinely glad to recommend him to the society. His presence, she thought, had improved the company. She hoped earnestly for his recovery. She'd already arranged to send him a few books at the hospital, knowing his fondness for reading. Everything was properly said. Indeed, that was precisely what struck Miss Marple. Every expression of concern was correctly placed. Every note of regret was sounded at exactly the right pitch. Mrs. Whitcomb's sympathy had the admirable form of something well-bred, considered, and entirely appropriate. There was nothing one could point to and say, "There, that is wrong." And yet Miss Marple, who had spent a great many years watching people in drawing rooms, committee meetings, sick rooms, trains, and village lanes, had developed a sensitivity not merely to what was said, but to the degree of inward spontaneity from which it arose. There is a distinction, she often reflected, between a person who is genuinely distressed and trying to speak naturally, and a person who is speaking naturally because he or she has already determined what natural ought to look like. The first kind of person may pause, choose a word badly, contradict an earlier remark, or allow some passing and unarranged emotion to disturb the surface of composure. The second kind rarely commits such small irregularities. The performance has been prepared in advance. Mrs. Whitcomb made no irregularities at all. This, of course, proved nothing. There are people genuinely composed by temperament who meet disturbing events with real steadiness born of discipline, breeding, and long habit. Miss Marple knew that perfectly well and had no wish to be unjust. But there was in Mrs. Whitcomb's composure that afternoon something just a shade too settled, too complete, too ready, too free from the slight internal disorder that true surprise generally leaves behind it. The impression was a small one. Miss Marple would have been unable, had she been asked, to define it to the satisfaction of anyone more literal than herself. Yet it remained with her in the same way that a single misplaced stitch may trouble the eye in a piece of familiar embroidery long after one has laid it aside. She observed something else too. At no point in the afternoon did Mrs. Whitcomb ask any question about Mr. Pritchard's illness, to which she did not appear already to possess an inward answer. She spoke of his collapse. She expressed hope. She remembered his qualities. But she did not exhibit that backward-turning perplexity which real shock so often produces, the impulse to revisit an event from several angles because the mind has not yet fully accepted what it has seen. She did not say, as many people would naturally say, "I cannot think how it happened," or "he seemed perfectly well," or "it was the most extraordinary thing." There was no searching astonishment in her recollection, no mental groping among possibilities. It was as though the event, though regrettable, had fitted itself into a pattern already prepared. Mrs. Whitcomb, Miss Marple, thought, had been very little surprised by Mr. Pritchard's collapse. After tea the gathering began to thin. Cups were set down. Gloves were found. People moved toward the door in twos and threes, each lingering just long enough to prove that they were not hurrying away merely because everyone else had begun to do so. Mrs. Fellows paused to discuss programme arrangements with Miss Armitage, and Miss Marple, having collected her knitting, found herself for a moment standing near the fireplace beside a small, neatly dressed woman who had spoken little throughout the afternoon. She had earlier been introduced as Mrs. Agnes Plum. Mrs. Plum was about 60, long-standing in the society and responsible for wardrobe and costumes, a sphere she was said to manage with considerable skill and seriousness. She had the quiet air of a person who notices much and volunteers little. There was nothing dramatic about her reserve. Indeed, reserve of that kind is often far more informative than garrulousness. As they stood together, Mrs. Plum said in a low, perfectly conversational tone that it had all been a very sad business, and that Mr. Pritchard had seemed in quite good health to her, all things considered. Miss Marple agreed. Mrs. Plum glanced toward the window before adding, in the same mild voice, that he had been a careful sort of man, noticing things. It was the sort of remark which, taken by itself, might have meant very little. It was lightly said and not pressed. But Miss Marple, who never hurried to fill silence, made only a small sound of acknowledgement and allowed the words to lie where they had been placed. Mrs. Plum offered no further explanation. A moment later, Mrs. Fellows reappeared at Miss Marple's side, cheerful and ready to go, with the information that the motor car was just outside. Miss Marple took her leave with pleasant brevity and accompanied her friend to the door. During the short walk to the car, she said almost nothing, but she carried with her, in that orderly private fashion which served her better than any written memorandum, two small observations. The first concerned the quality of Mrs. Whitcomb's composure. The second concerned Mrs. Plum's grammar. For Mrs. Plum had said, quite distinctly and without seeming aware of the fact, that Mr. Pritchard had been a careful sort of man. Not is. Had been. And there was, as yet, no reason in the world why she should have spoken of him as though he already belonged entirely to the past. Chapter 3. The Actor Who Failed to Make His Entrance. The days that followed Mr. Pritchard's collapse acquired that peculiar suspended quality, known so well in country places where everybody's waiting, with outward patience and inward agitation, for news that may prove either relieving or disastrous. Larkfield continued to transact its ordinary business with proper steadiness. Shop doors opened and shut, baskets were carried home from market, letters were posted and tea was poured at the usual hours. Yet beneath these familiar surfaces ran a heightened current of watchfulness. People spoke in lower tones, paused a little longer before offering conclusions, and displayed in one another's company that increased civility which often appears when a community feels itself to be standing, however briefly, on uncertain ground. The Larkfield Amateur Dramatic Society, deprived for the moment of its rehearsals, seemed to discover that it had formed habits of companionship stronger than anyone had quite acknowledged while matters were proceeding normally. Its members, finding themselves unexpectedly at leisure and not wishing perhaps to dwell too steadily upon the cause, drifted into a series of small social encounters, coffee taken here, tea accepted there, errands lengthened by conversation, all with the air of being incidental and yet serving very clearly the purpose of mutual reassurance. Miss Marple, for her part, found reason to go to Larkfield twice in the course of these days. The first occasion was an expedition with Mrs. Fellows to the haberdashery, an errand wholly unremarkable on its face, and indeed genuinely connected to the purchase of certain ribbons and buttons. The shop stood in the same street as the small café, where several members of the Dramatic Society were known to take their elevenses, and Miss Marple, who never disdained coincidence when it presented itself in a useful form, saw no reason not to benefit from the arrangement. The second visit was a quiet afternoon call upon Mrs. Agnes Plum. Mrs. Fellows had supplied the address readily enough, finding nothing at all curious in Miss Marple's expressed wish to know more about the costuming for the production. That an elderly lady with an interest in domestic arts might wish to visit a woman known for her needlework and theatrical wardrobe was perfectly natural. Indeed, it was perhaps the least suspicious motive imaginable. Mrs. Plum herself, being a practical creature and one who respected genuine interest in a craft, did not refuse the visit. The errand to the haberdashery yielded little that was specific, but a good deal that was quietly useful. Mrs. Birch, who kept the shop and possessed, like so many competent shopkeepers, a mind in which the opinions of the district arranged themselves almost automatically by subject and degree, remarked in passing that the general feeling in the town was strongly sympathetic toward Mr. Pritchard. Nobody, she said, seemed inclined to blame him in any vulgar way for overexerting himself. On the contrary, several people had observed that he was exactly the sort of sensible, orderly gentleman who would never knowingly disregard prudent advice about his health. Miss Marple thought that significant. A man may certainly be overtaken by illness despite every precaution. There is nothing unnatural in that. But a reputation for prudence is a thing earned by repeated small behaviours, and where such a reputation exists, it deserves attention. She stored away the remark with care, as she stored away many things, not because it proved anything in itself, but because true patterns are often built of very small consistencies. It was the visit to Mrs. Plum, however, that proved more fruitful. Mrs. Plum lived in a small house in a quiet residential street. Respectable, orderly, and without pretension. Her front sitting room doubled as a workroom, and bore all the agreeable signs of serious occupation. Lengths of folded fabric arranged upon chairs, dress forms standing in differing stages of completion, boxes of trim neatly stacked beneath a side table, and the general impression of useful activity temporarily paused rather than tidied away for effect. The room had the pleasant, untidy honesty of a place where things are actually made. Mrs. Plum received Miss Marple with a capable handshake and the undemonstrative hospitality of a woman who values good manners without embroidering them. Tea appeared promptly. A rare plate of biscuits was set between them. Mrs. Plum took her chair with the settled ease of a person entirely at home in her surroundings, and for some little time the conversation concerned itself with the subject which had ostensibly brought Miss Marple there. Costume. It was in fact a subject upon which Mrs. Plum could speak with real knowledge and moderate pleasure. She had over many years clothed all manner of amateur performers, and had developed the philosophical tolerance necessary for dealing with men and women who often entertained vivid convictions about the kind of figures they cut upon a stage. She described, with dry humour, the challenge of dressing people who were certain they ought to look romantic, commanding, youthful, or tragic, when nature had perhaps equipped them rather more firmly for stoutness, earnestness, or middle-aged respectability. Miss Marple listened with genuine enjoyment. When Mr. Pritchard's name arose, it did so as an exception. Mrs. Plum observed that he had been refreshingly straightforward in all costume matters, accepting her judgment readily and without vanity. He had not, she said, attempted to improve upon practical decisions by means of theatrical notions about himself. That, too, Miss Marple thought, was consistent with the general portrait that was emerging. A careful man, orderly in his habits, not given to unnecessary display where practical matters were concerned. After a suitable interval, Miss Marple asked in the easiest possible manner whether Mr. Pritchard had seemed quite himself during the last rehearsals before his collapse. Mrs. Plum considered before answering. She had the useful habit of not speaking until she had settled what she meant. At length she said that during the final week or thereabouts he had seemed rather preoccupied. Not unwell, she added. She would not have said that. Nor yet distracted in the ordinary way of a man with too many small tasks upon his mind. It had been something more inward than that. Twice during rehearsal breaks she had seen him standing in the backstage corridor reading papers of some sort. On each occasion he had put them away rather quickly when he realized he was observed. She had thought little of it at the time. People receive letters, people carry private documents. The theatre, with its pauses and waiting about, provides ample opportunity for the handling of personal business. Yet looking back now, she admitted, she found herself wondering what those papers had been, and whether they had anything to do with the condition of mind into which he had lately fallen. Miss Marple wondered also, but did not say so. She asked instead whether anything in particular had struck Mrs. Plum about the evening of the collapse itself. Mrs. Plum was silent for a moment. Then she said, with careful exactness, that Mr. Pritchard had, if anything, seemed in better spirits that evening than he had during the preceding days. More settled, perhaps, was the right word. She had taken it at the time for the natural result of returning to work after some slight private anxiety. Certainly there had been nothing in his manner to suggest a man already feeling physically overcome. He had not appeared short of breath. He had not complained of discomfort. He had not looked pale or unsteady. There had been, however, one small circumstance. He had arrived late. The others had already been assembled backstage for some 20 minutes before he appeared. During that interval, Mrs. Whitcomb had been present with her clipboard, distributing notes from Mr. Horton regarding the evening's programme and making the usual practical arrangements. Miss Marple made a little sound of interest and let Mrs. Plum continue at her own pace. It was then that another detail emerged, one that Miss Marple had already heard in second-hand form from Mrs. Fellows, who had received it through Miss Armitage, but which now came with the greater value of confirmation from someone more exact. Mr. Pritchard, shortly before rehearsal began, had asked Mr. Horton whether they might run again a scene from the second act, though it was not on the evening's scheduled programme. This scene, Mrs. Plum said, was a fairly extended exchange between the two principal characters and was staged at the centre of the boards, directly beneath the main lamp. Mr. Pritchard had explained that he did not yet feel wholly settled into the rhythm of the dialogue and would be grateful for another pass through it. Mr. Horton, being a man who found additional rehearsal inherently virtuous, had agreed without hesitation. What had seemed faintly curious to Mrs. Plum, though she had not attached significance to it at the time, was the sequence in which the thing had occurred. Very shortly before making that request, Mrs. Whitcomb had suggested to Mr. Pritchard, with ordinary kindness, that he might spend the opening part of the evening in the green room rather than on stage. The lighting man, she said, would be making some adjustments, and the lamps could become extremely warm during the process. Mr. Pritchard had thanked her, declined pleasantly, and remained where he was. Then, soon afterward, he had specifically asked to rehearse the very scene which would keep him longest beneath the strongest light. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Premature comment, she had long ago learned, is one of the most expensive errors of inquiry. It warns those who ought not yet to be warned, and it also has the unfortunate effect of fixing people's accounts before one has properly tested their natural shape. She merely thanked Mrs. Plum for a most pleasant and interesting afternoon, praised her skill with the costume sincerely, and took her leave with umbrella, gloves and knitting bag in perfect order. On the drive back to St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Fellows, who was at the wheel, was aware that her companion had fallen into one of those reflective silences that meant active thought rather than fatigue. Being a considerate soul and familiar enough with Miss Marple to recognise the quality of that silence, she made no attempt to break it. Miss Marple was thinking about heat. The lamps above the Larkfield stage were modern electric ones, strong, efficient and entirely capable, when concentrated upon a fixed point for any length of time, of creating a heat distinctly greater than that of the surrounding theatre. Actors learned to bear this as a matter of course. They perspired, endured it, and adjusted themselves accordingly. But a person already weakened, whether by genuine illness or by some prior reduction of bodily strength, would feel such heat with far greater severity. Under sufficient strain, the body may collapse in a way that appears entirely natural. A weak heart subjected to thermal stress requires very little encouragement. Yet this led Miss Marple to the more important question, which was not about the heat itself. The heat was obvious. No one needed to create it. The lamps had always been there. Anyone on that stage knew their force. The more interesting matter was whether Mr. Pritchard had arrived beneath them already in a condition that made collapse likely, or whether something had occurred beforehand to place him in just such vulnerability. Mrs. Whitcomb had suggested he rest. Mrs. Whitcomb had suggested he avoid the lamps. Mr. Pritchard had declined both suggestions. Then he had chosen, of his own accord, to stand for an extended time directly beneath the strongest light, in a scene not originally scheduled for rehearsal. That, Miss Marple thought, did not resemble carelessness. It resembled decision. He had been preoccupied for days. He had been seen with papers. He had concealed them when noticed. On the evening itself he had seemed not anxious, but settled, as though some internal matter had moved, one way or another, from uncertainty into conclusion. A careful man, Mrs. Plum had called him. Miss Marple looked out at the hedgerows beyond the road, and considered the distinction between a man who is habitually careful and a man who has recently acquired a very particular reason to be so. The two states may look alike to casual observers, yet they arise from different inward conditions, and where one distinguishes them correctly, much else tends to become clearer. The evening was mild. The hedges were very green. Mrs. Fellows drove with admirable steadiness, refraining from the several questions she was plainly tempted to ask. Miss Marple was grateful. She required 1 or 2 more pieces before the pattern would fully declare itself. But she'd already formed a fairly good notion of where the next of those pieces might be found. Chapter 4. Courteous Applause. Inside the town hall. The Larkfield Town Hall stood at the junction of the High Street and the road leading toward the church, a solid Edwardian building of pale stone whose proportion suggested municipal seriousness without grandeur. It possessed tall sash windows, a broad flight of steps, and a notice board considerably more official in aspect than the one at St Mary Mead, where announcements tended to concern flower shows, jumble sales, and the activities of persons with admirable intentions but limited budgets. The town hall notice board concerned itself with lectures, committee meetings, improvement schemes, and the sort of public business that lends moderate places the agreeable illusion of importance. The hall served many purposes in the course of the year, and on the second Thursday of most months it provided a meeting room for the Larkfield Civic Improvement Society. This body, like so many public-minded local organisations, overlapped generously with several others. Its members included persons active in the hospital committee, the amateur dramatic society, parish events, public gardens, and those numerous worthy enterprises through which energetic residents distribute their conscientiousness. It was to one of these meetings, on the Thursday after her visit to Mrs. Plum, that Miss Marple came again with Mrs. Fellows. Mrs. Fellows had been a corresponding member of the Civic Improvement Society for some years, and attended its proceedings with the faithful regularity of someone who genuinely enjoyed institutional business. The stated subject for the afternoon was the upkeep of the public gardens, a topic substantial enough to warrant respectable attendance, and yet sufficiently harmless to ensure that conversation would soon drift outward into all manner of associated local concerns. Miss Marple's presence as Mrs. Fellow's companion appeared entirely natural. She had an authentic interest in horticulture, and no one, seeing a pleasant elderly lady seated quietly at such a meeting, would be likely to suspect that she had come to observe rather more than roses and paving borders. The room was moderately full. Some 20 people sat around the long, central table, with several more in chairs along the wall. The combined effect of June warmth, slightly imperfect ventilation, and prolonged civic attention produced an atmosphere that was close but not oppressive. Exactly the sort of atmosphere in which collars are loosened, tea becomes desirable, and conversational discipline relaxes in useful ways. Mr. Horton was present, which was only to be expected. He sat near the head of the table with the air of a man intimately connected with orderly proceedings and prepared, when required, to assist them with firmness. Miss Armitage was there too, in quiet conversation with another woman whose face Miss Marple did not know. Several others from the Dramatic Society, or from Miss Armitage's earlier tea-gathering, were distributed about the room. Mrs. Whitcomb, however, was not present. Miss Marple noticed that at once. The meeting proceeded in precisely the fashion such meetings often do. The public gardens were discussed with care, certain. Paths were declared in need of attention. Shrubbery was mentioned more than once, and a question arose concerning drainage at one corner of the lower beds. All this was treated with seriousness. Then, as happens whenever human beings gather under the respectable cover of official business, the discussion began to broaden. Local matters entered. Small items of news were exchanged. The meeting passed gently from structure into sociability, which was its true secondary purpose. It was during this latter phase that the subject of Mr. Pritchard's collapse returned, introduced with proper delicacy by Mr. Horton, who asked whether anyone had received later intelligence regarding the unfortunate gentleman's condition. The intelligence available was limited, but not discouraging. Dr. Clement Faraday, who stood near one of the windows in an attitude of relaxed alertness, said that Mr. Pritchard remained at the cottage hospital and was resting comfortably. His condition, while still requiring careful oversight, had not worsened. This was met with a round of relieved expressions, subdued, but genuine. Then conversation settled into the pattern Miss Marple had now begun to recognise. The pattern interested her not so much for what it contained as for what it consistently excluded. Each speaker emphasised Mr. Pritchard's charm, his enthusiasm, his conscientiousness, and the tendency he had shown to throw himself into dramatic work with perhaps a little too much vigour. Each account returned, almost by instinct, to the warmth of the stage lamps and the accepted fact of his cardiac weakness. And each account, by steps so smooth as almost to suggest rehearsal, arrived at the same conclusion: that the unhappy business had been entirely explicable, regrettable but natural, and in no need of further restless examination. What was absent was uncertainty. No one said that the thing puzzled them. No one said that it had struck them as odd. No one, even in the modest way people sometimes do when they half wish to invite contradiction, observed that there had been something about it they could not quite account for. The narrative had already hardened. That, Miss Marple knew, was not in itself evidence of anything sinister. Communities often settle upon a single explanation for a distressing event because leaving the matter open is uncomfortable, and most people do not enjoy the long chill of uncertainty. To agree upon a natural cause is, in a sense, a collective kindness. It closes the door gently upon speculation. Yet sometimes a settled narrative is not merely comforting. Sometimes it is convenient. And it was Mr. Thomas Vane who, without in the least intending to do so, supplied the most interesting detail of the afternoon. He sat across the table from Miss Marple, pleasant, agreeable, and entirely at ease with himself. He was the sort of young man whose natural confidence expresses itself in friendliness rather than brilliance, and whose conversation is so easy that people often underestimate how much he notices. Speaking of Mr. Pritchard in the warm tone everyone had adopted, he mentioned, almost casually, that some 10 days before the collapse the two of them had had a brief talk during a rehearsal break. Mr. Pritchard, he said, had asked him whether he happened to know anything about the management of the Society's charitable fundraising accounts. Mr. Vane had not known. He had referred him to Mrs. Whitcomb, who, he added cheerfully, managed such things as a matter of course. He offered the anecdote lightly, as evidence only of Mr. Pritchard's conscientious interest in the Society's affairs. No one at the table found anything unusual in it. Conversation moved on at once. Miss Marple, however, did not let it pass so easily. 10 days before the collapse, Mr. Pritchard had made inquiries into the Society's financial arrangements. Thereafter, he had been seen reading papers privately in the corridor backstage, and concealing them when observed. He had become preoccupied. Then, on the evening in question, he had appeared oddly settled, like a man who had reached a decision. These facts, taken together, were beginning to arrange themselves into a shape no longer easy to dismiss. Miss Marple waited patiently until the meeting had begun to break up. Chairs moved, papers were gathered. Persons who had spent an hour discussing public gardens now formed themselves into little clusters by the windows and doorways. Miss Marple, with the appearance of having no object beyond amiable sociability, made her way toward the window where Dr. Faraday remained in conversation with Mr. Horton on the subject of drainage near the lower beds. She joined them with a pleasant word and waited until the drainage question had exhausted itself. When Mr. Horton moved away, Miss Marple remarked to Dr. Faraday, in a tone of mild inquiry, that she had been very glad indeed to hear Mr. Pritchard was more comfortable. She hoped the hospital staff had found his general state otherwise sound. Dr. Faraday, a discreet man and a careful one, answered only that Mr. Pritchard was in excellent hands, and that such matters required time. Miss Marple agreed. After a moment she observed that the theatre had been extremely warm that evening, and that stage lighting, she had always understood, was often more powerful than persons unfamiliar with it imagined. Dr. Faraday said that this was certainly true. Miss Marple then added, in the same mild conversational tone, that the medical explanation must therefore have seemed very plain at once, the cause of the distress being so readily available. Dr. Faraday did not answer immediately. He was not a talkative man, nor one who hurried to fill silence merely because silence had appeared. Miss Marple had noticed at the theatre that his eyes were observant eyes, of the kind that take in more than the owner habitually says. At last he replied that the presentation had been entirely consistent with cardiac weakness under heat stress, and that this provided in itself a sufficient explanation for what had occurred. Miss Marple said that she was sure it did. She said it warmly and politely, but with the faintest possible space left between the words and their acceptance, a space so slight that only a sensitive person would hear it. Dr. Faraday heard it. She saw the recognition in a minute change of expression, quickly controlled. He then said, in a measured tone, that if anything further were to emerge concerning Mr. Pritchard's health, or the circumstances surrounding his collapse, it would naturally receive proper consideration. Miss Marple thanked him and said how reassuring it was to know such matters were in competent hands. Then she moved away to collect her coat and knitting bag and to find Mrs. Fellows among the dispersing company. As they walked back to the motor car, Mrs. Fellows remarked that the meeting had been rather a good one on the whole, and that the public garden seemed likely to be dealt with satisfactorily at last. Miss Marple replied that she thought several matters had advanced quite satisfactorily. Mrs. Fellows, who was used to answers of that sort, and had long ago learned not to demand explanations before they were ripe, accepted this without comment. They drove back towards St. Mary Mead through the long mellow light of the early summer evening. Miss Marple sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression perfectly undisturbed. But inwardly her thoughts were working with increasing precision. Mr. Pritchard had asked about the fundraising accounts. Mrs. Whitcomb had charge of them. Mr. Pritchard had then become preoccupied and privately engaged with papers. On the night of the collapse he had seemed not confused but resolved, and Dr. Faraday, though professionally correct in everything he said, had not given her the impression of a man wholly at ease with the obviousness of the obvious explanation. The matter, Miss Marple thought, was moving, not yet into certainty, but into shape. Chapter 5. Costumes left hanging along the corridor. There exists a particular kind of errand, well known to observant elderly ladies and seldom recognised for what it is by anyone else, which is not quite an errand in the strict sense, though it possesses all the outward propriety of one. It begins with some perfectly legitimate object, returning a borrowed book, delivering a recipe, asking after a pattern, bringing back a dish, and proceeds under the shelter of that object toward another purpose altogether, one rather less easy to explain if met by direct and literal minds. Miss Marple had employed this method on several occasions over the years, and had never found it fail her when used with patience and good manners. The legitimate object on this occasion was a small booklet on period costuming, which Mrs. Plum had lent her after their last conversation, believing, quite rightly, that Miss Marple would find pleasure in the details of historical construction and trimming. Miss Marple had indeed read it with genuine enjoyment, and was now returning it with genuine thanks. That her return of the booklet happened to coincide with the morning Mrs. Plum had casually mentioned she would be at the theatre, packing away the costumes was merely one of those agreeable conjunctions of circumstance that tend to favour people with orderly habits and reliable memories. Mrs. Plum received her at the side entrance of the Larkfield Theatre with the calm, unsurprised equanimity of a woman who had long ago decided that the world arranged itself as it pleased, and that her own task was simply to manage whatever work lay nearest to hand. She accepted the booklet with a nod, and said that if Miss Marple did not object to a little disorder, she would be very glad of company, as she was in the middle of putting the costumes away. Miss Marple replied truthfully that she was very fond of a little practical disorder. There is after all a distinction between the disorder of useful work and the disorder of people's private lives. The first tends to be honest, local, and curable. The second is apt to spread, disguise itself, and resist treatment with extraordinary persistence. Miss Marple had always found open trunks, folds of fabric, boxes of trimmings, and the temporary untidiness of accomplished hands infinitely more soothing than the invisible untidiness of concealed motives. The backstage corridor was long and narrow, running behind the stage from one side of the theatre to the other. Its walls were painted a serviceable cream, and its floor covered with dark linoleum dulled by the passage of many years of performers, stagehands, committee members, and anxious persons carrying props at inopportune moments. Along one wall stood 2 open travelling trunks, already partly filled, and against a series of hooks and brackets a temporary rail had been fastened from which hung the costumes of the current production awaiting packing. There were jackets, dresses, evening coats, shawls, hats, and various garments in intermediate states of order, all arranged with enough system to show that whatever confusion existed was a working confusion under firm control. Miss Marple moved slowly along the rail with every appearance of innocent admiration. Indeed, much of her admiration was not in the least assumed. Mrs. Plum's work deserved it. The cut of a sleeve here, the finishing of a seam there, the intelligent handling of a difficult cloth, the small economies by which limited means were made to serve a respectable effect. These things interested Miss Marple very much. She paused over a particularly well-turned jacket and asked a sensible question about the sourcing of the fabric, which led quite naturally to 10 minutes of satisfying discussion regarding the increasing difficulty of obtaining good material at a sensible price, the dubious quality of certain modern substitutes, and the expedients one was obliged to adopt when dressing people who expected elegance on committee budgets. Mrs. Plum spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who knew exactly what she was talking about, and therefore had no need to sound impressive. Miss Marple liked her the better for it. It was during this passage along the garments that she came to the jacket she had been hoping to find. It was dark wool, well cut, with a certain formal set to the shoulders. She recognised it at once as Mr. Pritchard's costume for the second act, the very costume he had worn on the evening of the collapse, and for the very scene he had specifically requested be rehearsed again beneath the strongest lamp. It hung now among the others with the blank composure of an object returned to silence after having been present at something decisive. Miss Marple's fingers moved over it lightly, examining the lining as naturally as one examines good workmanship. Her thumb slipped to the inner breast pocket. There was something inside. It was only a small folded paper, tucked not loosely but with the slight deliberation of something placed rather than forgotten. Miss Marple did not draw it out at once. She continued to inspect the jacket, asked one more question about buttonholes, and made some mild remark upon the preservation of dark wool under repeated use. Mrs. Plum, at that moment, had turned toward one of the trunks and was occupied in the rather effortful business of refolding a large costume piece of brocade. Then, with 2 quiet movements that wasted neither time nor gesture, Miss Marple removed the paper, unfolded it, and read it. It was a single sheet of notepaper written in a small, precise hand, exact, controlled, and highly characteristic of a man accustomed to setting down facts clearly for his own use. The note was brief. It referred, without any rhetorical excess, to certain discrepancies Mr. Pritchard had observed in the Society's accounts for the previous 3 charitable performances. 2 specific figures were named and compared against the corresponding amounts recorded in the publicly distributed programme records. The sums involved, the writer observed with dry restraint, were not trivial. The note concluded with a sentence Miss Marple read twice, that he intended to raise the matter with the appropriate party at the earliest opportunity, as he felt strongly that the hospital, and the patients for whose benefit these performances were supposedly given, deserved a full and accurate accounting of the funds raised in their name. There was no signature. There did not need to be one. Miss Marple refolded the paper carefully along its existing creases and returned it to the pocket exactly as she had found it. She then resumed her examination of the sleeve lining, commented with sincere approval upon the quality of the workmanship, and turned back toward Mrs. Plum with the same composed attention she had shown from the beginning. Mrs. Plum accepted the transition without the smallest sign of curiosity. Miss Marple thought again that she was a woman who had sensibly resolved not to make a career of noticing every current that passed around her. That did not mean she saw nothing. Quite the contrary. But she was of the practical kind who understand that some observations are best stored quietly unless there is a clear use for them. They remained together another half-hour, Mrs. Plum packing, and Miss Marple providing the kind of steady, undemanding conversation that makes practical labour companionable without interrupting it. The subject of Mr. Pritchard was not raised, yet Miss Marple had the distinct impression that he occupied somewhat more of Mrs. Plum's thoughts than her expression suggested. At length, Miss Marple took up her gloves and prepared to leave. Before doing so, she paused by the entrance to the corridor and looked back along the line of costumes. She then asked, in the tone of one, making only the most casual inquiry, whether Mrs. Plum thought the costumes would soon be needed again, or whether the future of the production remained uncertain. Mrs. Plum set down the lid of the trunk she had just fastened. She said that Mr. Horton had spoken only the day before about the possibility of continuing with a revised cast if Mr. Pritchard's recovery proved prolonged. There was, she added dryly, never much shortage of people willing to accept an expanded role. The name she mentioned, without emphasis, was Mr. Roger Allop, a long-standing member of the society who had originally hoped for the principal part and had been passed over in favour of Mr. Pritchard. He had accepted this, she said, with the dignified resignation of a man who had learned to keep certain feelings private. Miss Marple received the information with a pleasant little nod and made her farewells. As she walked to the end of the street where Mrs. Fellows was to collect her at the agreed hour, she thought about the note. She thought about the figures it mentioned, and about the sort of courage required to put such observations into words before taking action upon them. Mr. Pritchard, by every accumulating indication, had been a careful and orderly man, a man who noticed things thoroughly and preferred to think them through before he spoke. He was precisely the type to make a written memorandum, not because memory would fail him, but because clarity mattered to him. He had intended to raise the matter with the appropriate party. The appropriate party, where the Society's charitable accounts were concerned, was Mrs. Whitcomb. And Mrs. Whitcomb, Mr. Vane had said, was the person to whom Mr. Pritchard had been directed when he first inquired into the financial arrangements. Mrs. Whitcomb had been present on the evening of the collapse. Mrs. Whitcomb had, with her habitual thoughtful kindness, offered him a restorative drink before rehearsal began. Mrs. Whitcomb had advised him to rest. Mrs. Whitcomb had suggested he avoid the heat of the stage. Miss Marple stood quietly at the corner in the mild June morning, her hands folded over her bag, and watched a sparrow investigating the base of a garden wall with quick, methodical attention. Presently the bird found what it sought, and flew off with it at once, leaving behind no trace of its search. A careful creature, Miss Marple thought, leaves very little about, and a careful person, if placed in danger behind the strong protective shield of general admiration and long-established good opinion, would understand exceedingly well the value of promptness, tidiness, and invisible action. Mrs. Fellows's motor car appeared at the far end of the street. Miss Marple raised a hand and began to walk toward it with her usual composed step. She'd found what she'd hoped to find, and she had left everything exactly where it was. For the moment, that was very much as it ought to be. Chapter 6. A programme published. Ahead of time. Among the quieter but more reliable pleasures of village life is the printed programme. No document of such modest physical dimensions receives, in proportion to its size, so extraordinary a quantity of attention from the persons responsible for producing it. The choice of type, the order of names, the exact phrasing of acknowledgements, the question of whether committee members should be listed alphabetically or by seniority, and if by seniority, whether that should be measured by years of service or weight of contribution. These and many related points are capable of absorbing a quite astonishing amount of serious local energy. The finished result is usually a folded card of 4 or 6 pages, which its creators regard with a satisfaction far exceeding its scale, and which half the audience will tuck into a pocket before the first act is over. The programme for the Larkfield Amateur Dramatic Society's forthcoming charity performance had already been printed. Miss Marple learned this from Mrs. Fellows on the Monday of the following week, 3 days before Mr. Pritchard's collapse. There was nothing particularly unusual in the fact itself. Productions of this kind often required such things to be arranged in advance, and the local printer in Larkfield was known to prefer all obligations settled well before the week of a significant public event. What was slightly unusual, Mrs. Fellows mentioned without attaching any significance to it, was that 24 copies had already been distributed, left in a stack at Mrs. Birch's haberdashery for collection by those who had purchased tickets early. One such copy had come, by the indirect but entirely respectable route of Mrs. Fellows' own errand, into the sitting room of Miss Marple's cottage. Mrs. Fellows had brought it along on a call, thinking it might interest her. Miss Marple thanked her and set it beside her knitting, while Mrs. Fellows gave a brief account of the latest hospital news. Mr. Pritchard, it seemed, had been able to sit up the previous afternoon and had asked for a particular novel. This had been interpreted by the hospital staff quite sensibly as a hopeful indication of returning strength. Mrs. Fellows, who knew him only slightly, expressed uncomplicated pleasure at the report, and after a little further conversation took her leave. When she had gone, Miss Marple poured herself a second cup of tea and opened the programme. It was a well-produced little document. 4 pages of cream card neatly printed with the Society's emblem at the top, a theatrical lamp encircled by a modest wreath of laurel that conveyed aspiration without absurdity. Inside were listed the cast and their roles, a brief description of the play and its 3 acts, several notes of thanks to donors and local supporters, and finally a statement that the proceeds of the evening were to be divided between the Larkfield Cottage Hospital General Fund and a smaller allocation for the renovation of the children's ward. Miss Marple read the programme through twice, as was her custom. Then she read it a third time with closer attention. The acknowledgements page was arranged conventionally enough. At the top, in slightly larger type, the Society's officers were listed. Mr. Geoffrey Horton as chairman, Miss Pamela Trent as secretary, and Mrs. Ellen Whitcomb as treasurer and charitable liaison. A dual description which indicated, with compact efficiency, how extensive her responsibilities had become. Beneath this came the production credits. Beneath those, in a section headed Charitable Record, there was a brief historical summary of the Society's previous fundraising successes. It was this section that Miss Marple studied most carefully. The Charitable Record listed in chronological order the major benefit performances of the past 11 years, giving for each the event, the date, and the sum raised for the designated cause. It was plainly intended as a testimonial to the Society's long and generous service to the district, and on the face of it, it served that purpose admirably. The figures were respectable. They reflected the kind of steady, modest generosity that well-run amateur societies tend to inspire in communities inclined to support them. Mrs. Whitcomb's name appeared beside each entry as organising authority, a consistency that testified to her decade of dedication and public usefulness. It was a record any reasonable person would find impressive. Miss Marple found it impressive in rather more ways than one. She was not, in the professional sense, an accountant. She had no pretensions to technical expertise, but over the course of a long life she had acquired a practical familiarity with small community finances, subscription lists, parish funds, jumble sale tallies, flower show collections, and all the innumerable little reckonings by which village life supports its institutions. More than that, she possessed something better than technical training in such matters. She had a well-developed instinct for the point at which numbers cease to feel like a natural record and begin to feel like a managed presentation. This was not a ledger, it was a summary. It showed totals, not breakdowns, and the totals taken one by one were perfectly plausible. Yet when read in sequence, a pattern appeared, one of those faint patterns which do not so much announce themselves as produce in the mind of the attentive observer a very slight but definite pause. In the earlier years of Mrs. Whitcomb's stewardship, the sums recorded appeared consistent with the scale of the productions and the attendance these same programme notes implied. In the later years, particularly the last 4, the figures drifted gently but perceptibly downward, relative to what one might reasonably expect from the growing ambitions of the productions and the increasing goodwill of the community. The events had become more established, more polished, more widely supported. The audiences, by all accounts, had grown. The charitable totals, however, had not advanced as they naturally ought to have done. That was what disturbed her. Not that the numbers were impossible, that they were slightly too modest. Miss Marple set the programme down and looked out of the window at her garden, where the early roses were proceeding with unhurried dignity toward their best display of the year. She was thinking of Mr. Pritchard's note. He had identified two figures that did not reconcile with the programme records. He had been a man of professional experience with accounts. He had, at some point during his involvement with the society, done essentially what she was doing now, read the public record carefully and asked himself what it implied. The difference between them was that Mr. Pritchard had apparently intended to act. He had meant to raise the matter directly with Mrs. Whitcomb. Miss Marple considered this, intention with sympathy, and also with that mild inward impatience which a naturally cautious person feels when contemplating the conduct of someone more straightforward than the situation altogether warrants. She did not doubt his motives. They were clearly honourable. He had wished to protect the hospital and preserve the integrity of the society he had joined, but there was perhaps a slight underestimation in his method, not of the financial irregularity itself, which he had recognised clearly enough, but of the nature of the person with whom he was dealing. There are some people, Miss Marple often thought, whose respectability is simply part of their character, something native, unconstructed, neither performed nor guarded except in the ordinary way decent people guard their good name. And then there are others for whom respectability is an edifice. It has been built carefully, maintained diligently, and made central to everything. Such people know exactly what advantages it brings, how many doors it opens, how thoroughly it disables suspicion in others, and because they know these things, they are prepared, when necessary, to defend that appearance with extraordinary calm. The first kind of person, when faced with exposure, is apt to become flurried, ashamed, confused, and often, in the end, persuadable. The second kind remains composed and acts. Mrs. Whitcomb, in Miss Marple's estimation, belonged very much to the second category. She picked up the programme again and reviewed the charitable record, this time with particular attention to the 3 performances Mr. Pritchard's note had plainly marked out. The figures were there, publicly printed, accepted, unchallenged. Presumably they had been examined by no one, because no one had thought examination necessary. They had been received as evidence of faithful service by a community that had every reason to trust the woman who produced them, and no immediate reason to imagine deceit. That, Miss Marple thought, was the real cleverness of it, if cleverness was quite the word for something less like ingenuity than exploitation. It relied not upon elaborate falsification, but upon trust. People trusted Mrs. Whitcomb because they had always trusted her, because she had given them no visible reason not to, because she seemed in every way the sort of woman communities are relieved to admire. The accounts were one of the few departments of her authority that nobody truly saw in operation. They were accepted, not observed, and so they had remained untested for years. Until Mr. Pritchard came, he had arrived with professional habits, an orderly mind, and the clear, unencumbered eye of a newcomer. He had looked where others had not looked, and because he had no history of trusting the system, he had seen what the others had failed even to consider. Miss Marple folded the programme and placed it in the drawer of the small writing desk in the corner of her sitting room, the drawer, reserved for things worth keeping safe. Then she took up her knitting and worked for some time without attending very much to the stitches, which was often the state in which her mind worked best. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the garden with the easy, unremarkable progress of a fine June day. St. Mary Mead continued about its business in the comfortable belief that the world was, on the whole, a manageable place. Miss Marple shared that view in principle, but she had long known that the manageability of the world depends rather heavily upon somebody being willing to attend quietly to whatever does not fit. She would need, she thought, to speak to Dr. Faraday again, and she was also beginning to believe that a conversation with the local inspector, properly introduced, carefully timed and supported by a pattern sufficiently formed to command official patience, might prove more useful than she had at first supposed. There was, however, one further piece of information she wished to obtain before taking that step. She turned the knitting in her hands, began a new row, and gave to the question of when and how to proceed the same patient, sustained attention she always believed good inquiry deserved. Chapter 7. Comments Whispered Behind the Curtain. There are conversations which take place in the wings of any communal enterprise, and these are very seldom the least informative. The official discourse of committees, meetings, and organised social occasions possesses the quality of a performance carefully shaped by the awareness of an audience. The unofficial discourse that occurs in corridors, at side tables, in drawing-room corners, and in the brief intervals between one obligation and the next is much freer in character and correspondingly richer in the sort of detail that does not survive the journey into more formal settings. Miss Marple had always found the wings more instructive than the stage. It was a preference that had served her admirably over a great many years, and it served her again now. The occasion was a small gathering at the home of Mr. Geoffrey Horton, convened ostensibly to discuss whether the charity performance should be postponed or whether a suitable replacement for Mr. Pritchard's role might be found in time to preserve something of the original arrangement. Mr. Horton had invited a select group of the Society's senior members, together with one or two persons whose connection with the matter was not wholly official but perfectly acceptable in local terms. Mrs. Fellows had received her own inclusion, with the pleased surprise of a woman who occasionally forgot the extent to which her social usefulness had broadened over the years. She brought Miss Marple with her on the simple ground that Miss Marple was staying with her for a few days, an explanation they had accepted between themselves without needing to discuss it. Mr. Horton's house stood on the better side of Larkfield, a solid Victorian property, well maintained and furnished in the manner of a man who had definite views about comfort, and had implemented them without undue concern for passing taste. The drawing-room was generous in size, respectably warm despite the mildness of the evening, and full of those earnest domestic arrangements by which people of method make hospitality appear both proper and dependable. Mr. Horton moved among his guests with the faintly proprietorial air of a host, who considered his entertainments a species of civic contribution. The business part of the evening was dispatched with reasonable speed. It was agreed that Mr. Roger Allop, whose long acquaintance with the part made him the natural substitute, should be asked to assume the principal role, and that the performance date would be moved back by 1 week to allow time for additional rehearsal. Mr. Horton recorded these decisions in his small notebook with the satisfaction of a man to whom resolutions were not merely necessary but intrinsically pleasing. With the agenda concluded, the gathering relaxed at once into the easier and more revealing phase of the evening. It was during this transition from business to sociability that Miss Marple had her most productive conversation of the week. Mr. Allop himself was present, a compact, deliberate man of about 55, with a greying moustache and the careful deportment of someone who had learned that dignity is a resource best employed consistently and without fuss. He had accepted the prospect of the larger role with measured pleasure, contriving to display neither triumph at another man's misfortune nor false modesty about his own abilities. He was, Miss Marple thought, one of those men who had spent some time deciding how they wished to occupy a room, and had arrived at a solution they found satisfactory. He stood near the bookcase with a glass of sherry in his hand, when Miss Marple drifted in that direction, carrying her own glass of sherry and wearing the pleasant expression which announces nothing more threatening than an inclination toward harmless conversation. They spoke first of the production. Mr. Allop proved to have a thorough and genuine enthusiasm for it. He had followed its development with interest from the beginning, which was understandable given his own earlier hopes of casting, and he considered the play stronger than several the Society had attempted in recent years. Miss Marple agreed that from what she'd seen at rehearsal, it had appeared very promising indeed. She then asked, with the straightforward interest of a person who knows nothing, and wishes to know more, whether Mr. Allop had known Mr. Pritchard before his arrival in the district, or whether their acquaintance had been formed entirely through the society. Mr. Allop's answer was delivered with a degree of care Miss Marple noted without seeming to do so. He said that he had not known Mr. Pritchard personally before that time, but had been aware of him in a general way through the small world of amateur theatrical circles in the county, where names and reputations circulate with modest but reliable thoroughness. Mr. Pritchard, he understood, had a considerable background not merely in performance, but in theatrical administration, having spent some years in professional employment with a theatrical management firm before retiring to the district. Miss Marple expressed interest in this at once. Theatrical administration, she observed, must require a very particular kind of mind, part artistic sensibility, part practical order. Mr. Allop agreed that this was precisely so. Then, with the slight deliberateness of someone choosing to say something he had privately debated, he added that Mr. Pritchard had in fact mentioned to him, during one of the earlier rehearsal evenings, that his own work had been specifically in accounts and production finance. The position, he had said, gave him extensive experience in the financial management of theatrical ventures. He paused after saying this, not awkwardly, but in the manner of a man who has placed a fact in front of another person and is willing to leave it there. Miss Marple said that was extremely interesting, and that such experience would surely make anyone rather attentive to the financial details of any production in which he was involved, even an amateur one. Mr. Allop replied, with perfect composure, that he thought it probably would. There followed a brief silence of the companionable kind which sometimes arises when two people have understood one another without needing to be explicit. Then Mr. Horton appeared at Mr. Allop's elbow with a question about rehearsal timings, and the conversation ended naturally. Miss Marple moved away in her unhurried fashion toward the farther side of the room, where a small group had formed around Miss Armitage, who was describing with some animation a previous production in which a scene change had gone memorably wrong. Miss Marple listened, laughed when required, and waited for the anecdote to conclude before, by a route so gradual as to be almost invisible, guiding the subject toward the practical administration of the Society's charitable work. Miss Armitage, who had been with the Society for 12 years and retained a very good memory for its institutional history, was perfectly willing to explain. The arrangement, she said, had gradually evolved into a remarkably streamlined one. Mrs. Whitcomb managed the charitable liaison, which meant overseeing the collection of ticket proceeds, corresponding with the recipient organisations, and ensuring that the necessary documentation was prepared for the Society's records. The chairman signed off on the annual summary, of course, but the day-to-day handling of figures and correspondence had for many years rested with Mrs. Whitcomb. Miss Armitage described all this with the tone of someone speaking of an arrangement so familiar that it had ceased to attract notice at all, which was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the condition in which such arrangements become most useful to the person who benefits from them. She therefore asked, in the easiest possible manner, whether the system had ever produced any practical complications. Miss Armitage considered. There had been, she said, one small difficulty perhaps 6 or 7 years earlier, when a discrepancy in printing costs had required some adjustment to the final accounting. But Mrs. Whitcomb had dealt with it quietly, and the matter had never become troublesome. Miss Armitage offered this not as criticism, but as an example of Mrs. Whitcomb's efficiency. Miss Marple received it in exactly that spirit, though she stored the detail away with the others she had been accumulating. The evening concluded pleasantly. Mr. Horton distributed a final round of refreshments and summarised the decisions taken with the quiet satisfaction of a man who considered a concluded agenda a small but genuine contribution to civilization. Guests departed by ones and twos into the mild June night. Mrs. Fellows and Miss Marple walked to the motor car beneath a sky which, even at that late hour, retained along the western horizon a faint luminous afterglow. Before starting the engine, Mrs. Fellows asked whether Miss Marple had enjoyed the evening. Miss Marple replied that she had found it extremely informative. Mrs. Fellows, who had driven Miss Marple home from a number of such occasions over the years and had some idea what that form of answer generally implied, said nothing more and started the car. The road back to St Mary Mead was quiet. Hedgerows stood dark against the last of the evening light, and the open fields beyond them lay in a wide, patient stillness. Miss Marple sat looking out at them with an expression Mrs. Fellows, had she seen it, would have recognised at once. Something had settled into place. Mr. Pritchard had not merely been a man who noticed things. He had been a man with the professional knowledge to understand the significance of what he noticed, and with the professional habit, formed over years of dealing with figures that must be correct because the consequences of their being incorrect are immediate and demonstrable, of writing down his conclusions before acting on them. He had discovered the irregularities. He had noted them carefully. He had, at some point after being directed toward Mrs. Whitcomb by Mr. Vane, either raised the matter with her or made plain his intention of doing so. Mrs. Whitcomb would have understood, with the quick and undeceived intelligence of a woman who had maintained her position for years by precisely this sort of management, exactly what was at stake. Not merely the money, though that was considerable enough, but the whole edifice built around it. The charitable reputation, the hospital committee, the fete, the public trust, the long habit of being admired, the deference of others to her, judgment, everything that had come to define her place in the district. All of it endangered by one careful man with a professional eye and a principled disposition. Miss Marple thought about the restorative drink offered with such natural kindness before rehearsal. She thought about the scene beneath the strongest lights, requested by a man who had declined to be directed away from the stage by someone whose advice he may already have learned to distrust. She thought of heat and strain, and what little encouragement a weakened heart may require once it has been placed at disadvantage, and she thought, with the gentle and slightly sorrowful clarity that always accompanied her arrival at the truth of the painful matter, what it must mean to have constructed an entire life of admirable conduct, much of it perhaps genuine in its outward expressions, and to have allowed within that life one concealed and continuing fault to grow, until the moment came when its exposure appeared to require something unforgivable. The motor car turned into the familiar lane, and the lights of St Mary Mead appeared ahead, warm, small, and steady in the dark. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, and decided that she would speak to the inspector in the morning. Chapter 8. The show no one ever finished. The Larkfield police station was a modest establishment of the kind which suggests, by its appearance, that its principal function is the reassurance of the community rather than the suppression of any unusually dramatic disorder. It occupied the ground floor of a plain building on a side street off the market square, with a painted sign above the door weathered to a condition of respectable fatigue. The front counter was attended on the morning of Miss Marple's visit by a young constable of perhaps 22, who possessed the scrubbed and attentive look of someone recently installed in a position of minor but genuine responsibility, and not yet weary of finding that agreeable. Miss Marple presented herself at the desk with the pleasant directness of a woman who had long since ceased to feel any uncertainty about how such inquiries ought to be made. She asked whether Inspector Granger was available, gave her name without flourish, and added only that she believed she had some information which might interest him in connection with the recent incident at the Larkfield Theatre. The constable received this with a momentary expression of uncertainty, as though he were not entirely sure how to classify an elderly lady with a knitting bag and an air of composed assurance, but disappeared through an interior door to make the necessary inquiry. Inspector Harold Granger appeared within 5 minutes, which in itself was a species of information. He was a man of about 50, neither tall nor short, with a broad, steady face that had settled over the years into an expression of alert patience. He had served in the district long enough to understand that places of this sort produced with surprising regularity exactly the kind of complication which looks like nothing from a distance, and proves, upon examination, to be rather significant. He showed Miss Marple into a small office furnished with a table, 4 chairs, and a window overlooking the station yard, and offered tea, which she accepted. He had heard of Miss Marple. That too was a form of information, and she read in his courteous attentiveness the quality of a man who'd been told something by reliable sources and was reserving judgment until he had formed one of his own. She began, as she always preferred to begin, at the practical end of the matter rather than the theoretical. She told him about the programme, describing the charitable record and the pattern she had observed in the figures with the careful precision of someone who understands very well the difference between an impression and a demonstrable fact, and who wishes to be clearly understood about which of the two she is offering. She then told him about the note in Mr. Pritchard's costume jacket, its location, its contents, and the fact that she had replaced it exactly as she found it, so that it ought still to be recoverable if he wished to examine it. Inspector Granger listened without interruption, his hands folded on the table before him, his expression one of steady evaluative attention. He asked only 2 questions, both practical ones: the precise position of the jacket in the theatre corridor, and the wording of the relevant entries in the programme's charitable record. Miss Marple answered both without hesitation. Then she told him about the drink. She described what she had pieced together from the various accounts she had quietly gathered, that Mrs. Whitcomb had been present backstage when Mr. Pritchard arrived late on the evening in question, that she had offered him a restorative drink of the kind one naturally offers when expressing concern for someone's comfort, that Mr. Pritchard had consumed it before speaking to Mr. Horton about rehearsing the additional scene, and that he had then remained for an extended period beneath the principal stage lamps in a heat that would greatly increase the strain on any heart already working under unnatural disadvantage. She said all this in a tone entirely without drama, because it was never her practice to supply drama to a situation that already contained more than enough of its own. Quiet certainty, she had found, was more persuasive than vehemence. When she'd finished, Inspector Granger remained silent for a little while. Outside the window the station yard was still. A pigeon had settled upon the low wall opposite with the settled satisfaction of a creature that had found a suitable perch and saw no reason to leave it. At length he said that the cardiac collapse had been assessed by Dr. Faraday as consistent with natural causes, and that without some reason to question that assessment no further inquiry had been thought necessary. Miss Marple replied at once that she understood perfectly, and that she considered Dr. Faraday a thoroughly competent man who had done exactly what the evidence before him at the time justified. She added, however, that she also believed him to be a man of sufficient care to welcome a second examination should circumstances warrant it, and that she rather suspected he might already be entertaining certain reservations of his own. She then described with suitable precision the brief conversation she had had with Dr. Faraday at the town hall meeting. Inspector Granger acknowledged this with a slight shift of expression, which neither committed him nor dismissed the possibility. He then asked whether she possessed any direct evidence that a harmful substance had been administered, beyond the inference from circumstances. Miss Marple said that she did not, which was precisely why she had come to him rather than to the Dramatic Society's committee. The circumstances, she said, were of the kind that a proper investigation would be very well placed to address, and there were avenues available to a police inspector which were not available to a retired lady from St. Mary Mead, however attentive. She said this with a degree of gentle good humour sufficient to keep it from sounding in the least impertinent, while leaving its substance untouched. Inspector Granger regarded her for a moment with the same steady evaluating look he had maintained throughout. Then he said that he would speak with Dr. Faraday that afternoon, and that he would look into the matter of the costume jacket. Miss Marple thanked him and rose to go. At the door she paused. There was one further point, she said, which might prove useful. Mrs. Whitcomb had managed the charitable accounting of the Society's productions for nearly 10 years without meaningful oversight. The records for those events would be somewhere among the Society's files, and a comparison between those records and the actual proceeds documented through the theatre box office and printing accounts might prove instructive. She was not, of course, in any position to conduct such a comparison herself. Inspector Granger said that he understood perfectly. Outside, the morning had continued in the agreeable, moderate fashion of a well-behaved English June day, warm without excess, bright without glare, and possessed of that settled light which makes even quite ordinary buildings appear momentarily more cheerful than they deserve. Miss Marple walked the short distance to the market square, and sat for a few minutes on a bench near the fountain. A comfortable-looking elderly gentleman beside her was reading a newspaper, and a small child nearby was investigating the coins at the fountain's edge with the absorbed seriousness of someone engaged in important research. Miss Marple sat and thought about Mrs. Whitcomb. It was impossible, she found, to think of her without a species of sadness that coexisted quite naturally with a clear understanding of what she had done. There was in the whole shape of the matter that particular sort of waste which Miss Marple had always found more troubling in its way than simple wickedness. Mrs. Whitcomb was not, she thought at her foundation, a cruel woman. The charitable work had been real. The public usefulness had been real. Even the warmth of her manner, she suspected, had not been wholly manufactured. She was a woman who had, at some point in the past, made one bad decision, and having made it, had found herself committed to preserving it. Having preserved it for long enough, she had gradually come to treat it not as an ongoing moral failure, but as one of the fixed conditions of her life. Then Mr. Pritchard had arrived, with his professional eye and his principled habits, and the long-managed arrangement had become suddenly dangerous. What Mrs. Whitcomb had done was not the act of a natural criminal. It was the act of a frightened person who had allowed the protection of reputation to become so indispensable to her sense of self that its loss had come, in some distorted private arithmetic, to seem worse than the alternative. Miss Marple understood that perfectly well. She did not excuse it. She had lived long enough to understand a great many things she did not excuse. The child at the fountain had retrieved one of the coins and was examining it with intense satisfaction. The elderly gentleman turned a page of his newspaper. The morning continued in its quiet and ordinary way. At length Miss Marple rose, collected her bag, and walked to the haberdashery, where she had a small purchase to make, and where Mrs. Birch could always be relied upon for a pleasant exchange of views about the prospects of the summer. These, on the whole, were considered favourable, the roses being in excellent condition, and the Church Fête Committee having secured what was believed to be a reliable forecast for the relevant Saturday. Miss Marple agreed that this was most encouraging. Then she walked home through the mild morning with the steady, thoughtful step of a person who has set something necessary in motion, and may now, with a clear conscience and appropriate patience, return for the moment to the ordinary business of the day. Chapter 9. Miss Marple considers the deceptive nature of appearances. Several days passed in the pleasant and outwardly unremarkable fashion of a summer week in which ordinary life, with its reliable little claims and duties, resumes possession after excitement. Miss Marple dead-headed her roses, wrote 2 letters, attended Sunday service, and received a visit from Mrs. Fellows, who brought with her a pot of gooseberry preserve and the information that Mr. Pritchard had, for the first time since his admission, been allowed to sit for an hour in the hospital garden on the previous afternoon. This, Mrs. Fellows declared, was considered by all who knew of it to be a most encouraging sign. Miss Marple agreed with complete sincerity. Whatever remained to be uncovered in the matter, it arranged itself rather better in a world that still contained Mr. Leonard Pritchard, and she was genuinely glad that the world, on this occasion, appeared inclined to preserve him. Inspector Granger came to see her on the Wednesday. He arrived at 10 o'clock precisely, declined tea with the slightly abstracted air of a man who had been drinking too much of it in too many other people's drawing-rooms, and had reached, for the time being, a point of temporary sufficiency, and accepted instead the armchair by the window. Into this he settled with the bearing of a person who had something definite to say, and was arranging himself for the saying of it in an orderly manner. Miss Marple sat opposite him, with her knitting in her lap, not actively in use, but held with the quiet instinct of one who takes comfort in having useful things near at hand, even when they cannot for the moment be used. Inspector Granger said he had spoken at length with Dr. Faraday. Dr. Faraday, it emerged, had indeed been entertaining reservations of his own for some days past. He was, Inspector Granger said, a conscientious man who had at first been entirely satisfied that Mr. Pritchard's collapse was natural, a serious cardiac episode brought on by heat stress and supported by the known history of cardiac weakness, already on Mr. Pritchard's medical record. The explanation had possessed at first sight all the completeness that discourages further inquiry. But Miss Marple's observations at the town hall, and more particularly the quality of quiet persistence with which a certain elderly lady had presented them, had remained lodged rather more firmly in Dr. Faraday's professional conscience than he had initially expected. As a result, he had returned to the hospital the following morning and ordered a further set of tests described in sufficiently routine terms to avoid attracting any unnecessary notice. The results of those tests had come back the previous day. "They are not," Inspector Granger said, with the measured understatement of a careful man repeating the words of another careful man, "entirely consistent with a purely natural episode." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am sorry to hear it confirmed," she said, "though I must admit I had rather expected it." Inspector Granger nodded. The substance involved, he explained, appeared to be of a type derived from plant material, though the precise identification was still being finalised. Its effect upon a person with Mr. Pritchard's pre-existing cardiac weakness, if administered in a moderate quantity and followed within the hour by prolonged exposure to strong-stage heat, would be to induce a cardiac crisis very readily mistaken for natural collapse, unless one had specific reason to look further. He paused, then added that the preparation was not one an ordinary careless person would arrive at by accident. It required some knowledge of plant properties and their effects, yet such knowledge, he said, was by no means inaccessible. It might be found by a person of intelligence and application in older herbal manuals, domestic medical books, or practical household references. The raw materials, moreover, could have been obtained by anyone possessing a competent kitchen garden and sufficient patience. Miss Marple said quietly that she thought this consistent with Mrs. Whitcomb's character. "She was a very thorough woman," Miss Marple said, "and self-reliant. Thoroughness in one part of life generally extends into others. A woman who managed a decade of charitable administration without assistance was unlikely to rely upon chance in a matter of greater urgency." Inspector Granger acknowledged this with the slightest inclination of his head. He then spoke of the costume jacket. The note had been found exactly where Miss Marple had described it. Its contents had been examined by a colleague with practical experience in financial matters, who had confirmed that the figures Mr. Pritchard had written down did not reconcile with the corresponding figures in the printed programme records. The discrepancies, taken across the 3 performances specifically identified and adjusted against known production expenses, suggested the diversion of several £100 accumulated over a period of 4 years. That amount, Inspector Granger added, was entirely consistent with the sort of irregularity that escapes notice, precisely because no single alteration is dramatic. Small adjustments, carefully repeated, attract no one's immediate concern. Over time, however, they amount to something very substantial indeed. The Society's fuller charitable records had now been obtained and were under examination. Early indications suggested that the pattern extended farther back than the 4 years most visibly traceable, through the public programme summaries. Miss Marple set her knitting down more squarely in her lap and looked out of the window for a moment toward the garden. "I thought it might be something of that kind," she said after a pause. "One does not develop the reflexes Mrs. Whitcomb displayed if the thing protected is recent and accidental. The speed of her assessment, the management of the danger, the maintenance of perfect composure throughout, it all had the quality of long practice. Those are habits formed over years." Inspector Granger said that this did indeed appear to be so. Then he asked her, with the care of a man who had turned the question over before speaking it aloud, how she had first come to suspect that the matter was not what it appeared. Miss Marple considered. She always respected a sincere question, and where a real answer was wanted, she preferred to give one rather than the sort of modest evasion that merely occupies the place where a truthful response ought to stand. It began, she said, with Mrs. Whitcomb's composure. She explained that when she had seen Mrs. Whitcomb at Miss Armitage's tea gathering, only days after the collapse, she had been struck by the completeness of that composure. There is, Miss Marple said, a difference between a person making an effort to compose herself in the face of distress and a person whose composure is already fully assembled before she enters the room. The former still carries small signs of internal weather, a slight effortfulness, tiny irregularities, some evidence that real feeling has not yet been entirely marshalled. Mrs. Whitcomb had shown none of that. Her calm had been complete, finished, and wholly without inward disturbance. That was the first thing, Miss Marple said. The second was Mrs. Plum's use of the past tense. She described that small moment exactly as she had noticed it at the time, and Inspector Granger listened with the concentrated attention of a man who understands that such details are not ornaments, but foundations. The smallest linguistic slip may reveal more than a formal statement carefully prepared for official ears. The third, Miss Marple continued, was the manner of Mr. Pritchard's collapse. She had been watching him from the front of the auditorium, and what she had seen did not resemble the abrupt and involuntary overthrow of a man taken wholly unawares by physical crisis. It had seemed instead like the movement of a man who feels something coming, and manages the arrival of it as best he can. He had not fallen so much as descended, with care, even with intention. That, of course, she added, was not medical evidence. I would never offer it as such. But it was enough to trouble me, and once one is troubled properly, one begins to look, Inspector Granger said, with directness rather than flattery, that it was a remarkable chain of observations to have made during a single evening's attendance at rehearsal. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I have had rather a long time to practice, she said, and village life, for all its apparent simplicity, provides a very comprehensive education in human nature. People in villages do exactly the same things as people anywhere else, only they are rather more visible while doing them. That seemed to please him. Then Miss Marple said something she had been turning over in her mind for several days, and which she now felt had reached the point at which it ought to be said. She hoped, she told him, that whatever course the matter took, consideration would be given not only to what Mrs. Whitcomb had done, but to what she had stopped short of doing. The administration of a harmful substance with deliberate intent was grave enough, and could not be made anything else by gentler language. But Mr. Pritchard was alive. He was sitting in hospital gardens in June sunshine, and appeared likely to recover. Mrs. Whitcomb had not once, the first act had been committed, pursued any further course of violence. Whether this reflected a limit to her intention, or merely the fact that the original attempt appeared to have succeeded, and therefore required no repetition, Miss Marple could not say with certainty. But she thought the distinction, though narrow, was still worth preserving. Inspector Granger was silent for a little while. Then he said, with the exact phrasing of a man who respects both law and proportion, that the circumstances would receive the full consideration they warranted. Miss Marple thanked him. She said she had every confidence that they would. He rose to take his leave, and she accompanied him to the door in the comfortable manner of a hostess concluding a satisfactory morning call. On the doorstep he paused and said, without flourish, that he was grateful for her assistance in the matter, and that he hoped she understood how materially it had contributed to an outcome which might otherwise have remained, as such things sometimes do, permanently unexplored. Miss Marple said that she was glad to have been of some small use. She watched him go down the garden path to where his motor car stood waiting, then returned indoors and paused for a moment in the stillness of the hallway before going through to the kitchen to set the kettle on. The house was peacefully quiet around her. Through the kitchen window the garden presented its best summer face, the roses now in their full confidence, the borders tidy, the whole small green world proceeding in the unhurried manner she had always found more reassuring than any quantity of human assurance. She made herself tea, carried it back to the sitting room, and took up her knitting once more. There was a blue cardigan which had been waiting for nearly 3 weeks to have its second sleeve finished, and Miss Marple saw no reason at all why it should wait longer. Chapter 10. The Stage. Once the audience had departed, Summer in St. Mary Mead does not conclude dramatically. It does not announce its departure, nor does it make any theatrical gesture toward autumn. It simply continues warm, settled, and fundamentally itself until one morning the quality of the light is very slightly altered, the garden asks for a somewhat different kind of attention, and one realizes that the season has changed so gradually that it is impossible to say on what precise day the alteration occurred. Miss Marple had always found something instructive in this. The significant changes in life, she reflected, rarely arrive in the abrupt form that makes them easy to identify at once. They proceed by degrees, each small in itself, each separately explicable, until the accumulation has become so substantial that the whole, looked back upon, appears almost inevitable. The matter of Mrs. Whitcomb unfolded in much this spirit. There was no public confrontation, no scene in the town hall, no emotional revelation in the theatre foyer, no collapse of reputations before an assembled local audience. Inspector Granger, who had struck Miss Marple from the beginning as a man who understood the difference between justice and spectacle, and valued the first considerably more than the second, conducted the rest of his inquiries with a thoroughness and discretion that did him credit. After some 2.5 weeks, there was, Miss Marple learned indirectly, a private interview with Mrs. Whitcomb at her house on a Tuesday morning. During that interview, the scope of what had been uncovered was laid before her, with the quiet force of evidence properly assembled, and therefore requiring very little embellishment. Mrs. Whitcomb, by all accounts, later reaching Miss Marple through the careful channels of Dr. Faraday, and one restrained remark from Inspector Granger himself, had received the interview with the composed dignity that had characterized her throughout. She had not denied what the evidence established. She had not, it seemed, resorted to excuses requiring responsibility to be shifted elsewhere. She had listened, she had acknowledged, and after a period of silence had said only that she understood what was now required of her. She left Larkfield within a fortnight. It was said that she had gone north to stay with a widowed sister, in a town at considerable remove from the district. This was presented publicly as a private family matter, which, in its essentials, it was. The explanation was received by the community with that subdued respect people reserve for the departure of someone long associated with useful public work, together with the faint but unmistakable awareness that things were not altogether as they had been supposed. Larkfield, like most communities, preferred not to name such recognitions directly. It simply altered its tone and proceeded. The Larkfield Amateur Dramatic Society handled its own transition, in the manner of organisations which have absorbed a shock and are determined to recover equilibrium without dwelling unnecessarily on the cause of the disturbance. Mr. Horton convened a committee meeting at which revised arrangements for charitable accounting were introduced. These now involved a small oversight committee of 3 members, rather than leaving the practical handling of financial matters in the hands of a single trusted individual. The adjustment was described in the minutes as a modernisation of administrative procedure. This was true, Miss Marple thought, in the way improvements often are true. They answer a need that has existed for some time, but which required a particular event before it could properly be acknowledged. The charity performance itself was not abandoned. It took place, as revised, on the 29th of June, with Mr. Roger Allop in the principal role, a party occupied with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time for an opportunity he always believed himself competent to fill, and finds the reality equal to expectation. Miss Armitage reported afterwards that the evening had been a considerable success, and that the final amount raised for the Larkfield Cottage Hospital had, if anything, exceeded hopes. Mrs. Fellows, who attended with Miss Marple, agreed entirely. Miss Marple watched the performance from the 3rd row with the attentive pleasure of someone who had earned, through a fair amount of private labour, the right to enjoy the evening now as a simple theatrical occasion. Mr. Allop was very good. The woman who had assumed the second female lead, a quiet and careful actress whose name Miss Marple had not previously remembered, proved to possess a genuinely touching quality in the more difficult scenes. The stage lamps burned above them all with their customary warmth, illuminating the action in that bright and slightly flattening way Miss Marple had noticed on her first visit to the theatre, though the lights now carried for her rather more associations than they had done then. At one point she allowed her eyes to rest for the briefest moment on the place where Mr. Pritchard had lowered himself to the stage floor some 6 weeks earlier. Then she returned her attention to the play with the deliberate composure of a person who knows that there comes a time to put certain things down. Mr. Pritchard himself had by then left the cottage hospital and gone to stay temporarily with a nephew in a village some 12 miles away, while his health recovered strength and regularity. Mrs. Plum, who maintained a reliable correspondence with a friend in that village, through channels entirely unrelated to amateur theatricals, mentioned during the interval that he was said to be in reasonable spirits, eating well, and expressing a cautious interest in returning, at some future stage, to dramatic work in one form or another. Miss Marple said she was very glad to hear it, and meant this without reservation. She and Mrs. Plum stood together through the interval with programmes in their hands and cups of rather indifferent tea, conversing in the easy manner of two people who share an understanding that does not require to be formally named. At one point Mrs. Plum remarked that it was fortunate such things had come to light when they did. Miss Marple agreed. Neither said anything further on the subject. The bell rang for the second act and they returned to their places. In the days after the performance, as June slipped into its last week and the district settled itself into the practical business of summer, Miss Marple found herself returning, in the quiet, habitual way of a mind that likes to leave matters long enough to settle properly, to the question that had accompanied the whole affair from the beginning, and which practical resolutions had not entirely answered. She thought about performances. There was the kind that takes place on a stage, open, temporary, and perfectly understood by everyone concerned. Performers put on costumes and characters for an evening and then lay them aside again at the close. Nothing about that was deceit, because the appearance had been agreed upon in advance. It was not concealment, it was a compact. And then there was the other sort of performance, the sort Mrs. Whitcomb had, in one sense, been giving for years. That performance was not declared, it was not temporary, it was not entered into jointly and in knowledge by those around her. And like all such sustained performances, it required an extraordinary expenditure of inward energy that might otherwise have gone into simply being what one was. The charitable work, Miss Marple believed, had been real. She believed that without sentimentality, and without any need to smooth away the contradiction it presented, a person may do genuine good in one part of life, and maintain, at the same time, a persistent dishonesty in another. The good is not therefore imaginary, nor is the dishonesty excused. Both things remain true. Human beings, Miss Marple had long ago observed, are singularly inconvenient to anyone who prefers moral bookkeeping to be tidy. What saddened her most, as she considered it while clipping faded roses on a warm afternoon, was not the dishonesty itself. That was familiar enough. It was the shape of the trap. Mrs. Whitcomb had probably not begun with a grand design. The first irregularity had perhaps been quite small. The temptation may have arisen from some immediate need or plausible justification. One does not usually begin by imagining a long deception. One begins by making a single exception to one's own standards, and then discovering later that the exception has altered the structure of everything that comes after it. Each year would have made the previous year harder to revisit. Each successful concealment would have increased the difficulty of stopping, until at last the whole edifice had become so interwoven with Mrs. Whitcomb's identity, reputation, habits, and place in the district that to lose it must have seemed to her less like correction than destruction. Then Mr. Pritchard had arrived with his professional eye and his quiet integrity. And what he threatened, Miss Marple thought, was not merely exposure, but the collapse of an entire version of herself which Mrs. Whitcomb had spent years constructing, inhabiting, and perhaps at length sincerely believing in. This was, to Miss Marple, the saddest part of the business. People who perform a false version of themselves for long enough do not always experience it as false. They experience it as the self they have worked hardest to become. That did not diminish the seriousness of what Mrs. Whitcomb had done to Mr. Pritchard. It did not soften Miss Marple's conviction that it required to be addressed, but it did render the matter sorrowful in a way that simpler wickedness is not. She had lived long enough to be comfortable with the coexistence of several truths, even when they pointed in different directions. The garden was very pleasant in the late afternoon light. The roses were a little past their best, though still carrying considerable colour, and the borders had taken on that slightly relaxed look peculiar to high summer, when things are no longer striving toward their first display, but are simply continuing cheerfully and with assurance in the condition proper to themselves. Mrs. Fellows called that evening. They sat together in the garden with cold drinks and spoke of the performance, the summer, the proposed new arrangement of the village flower rota, and whether the hairdresser's new assistant was settling satisfactorily. A matter of some local interest, though no immediate urgency. At one point Miss Marple said that she'd been thinking about performances. Mrs. Fellows asked what kind. Miss Marple replied that she had been considering the difference between the performances given on stages, which everyone understands to be temporary, and the performances given in ordinary life, which people sometimes forget are performances at all. Mrs. Fellows reflected on this and said that she supposed everyone presented themselves somewhat differently in different company, and that this was not necessarily dishonest so much as a sort of social management. Miss Marple agreed. Most of the time, she said, it is exactly that. The difficulty begins when the performance becomes the only version available, and when the person performing it has forgotten the difference between the role and the self. Actors, after all, know when the evening is over and the lights go down. That knowledge is rather valuable. Mrs. Fellows said she thought that a very interesting way of putting it. The garden lay quietly around them. The evening light came low and golden across the grass, and St. Mary Mead, in the soft and familiar calm of late summer, continued not toward any grand conclusion, but simply onward, one day at a time, in the place to which one belonged. Miss Marple finished her drink, looked toward the roses, and felt on the whole that the world was managing itself with reasonable adequacy. In her experience that was about the best one could honestly say of it, and it was quite sufficient.